Arguments about abortion often fail not because the reasoning is weak, but because the scope of the claim is mismatched to the audience. A narrow claim can be precise and powerful when both sides share the same background assumptions. But when the interlocutor's worldview is distant, different metaphysics, different moral thresholds, different intuitions, the same narrow claim becomes brittle. It carries hidden premises the other side never granted, and it becomes easy to reframe as a strawman. In these cases, a broader, more structural principle is the safer starting point. It creates shared footing, reduces misinterpretation, and forces the audience to reveal the assumptions they were silently relying on. Understanding when to begin narrow and expand outward, and when to begin broad and narrow inward, is a central skill in high-stakes moral argumentation. A narrow claim in a charged debate is often rejected immediately because the audience assumes you've already committed to the full set of controversial premises that would justify it. And that presumption triggers dismissal rather than curiosity. When a claim is framed narrowly, the interlocutor treats it as if its entire justificatory structure is already in place, so they refuse it before you've had any chance to lay the groundwork that would make it plausible. That early refusal tends to provoke rhetorical pushback, instead of a request for further reasoning. By contrast, beginning with a broader structural principle invites questions rather than objections, because it doesn't presume a threshold, ontology, or moral hinge the audience rejects. Working from broad to narrow lets you introduce commitments step by step, each justified by the shared principle already accepted, which prevents premature dismissal and keeps the conversation in an exploratory mode rather than a defensive one. The strength of an interlock argument depends on how well you calibrate the scope of your claims to the distance between your own framework and the framework of your audience. When two people share a tight cluster of assumptions, a principle can be stated narrowly and still land cleanly. But when the conceptual distance widens, when the interlocutor's ontology, values, or domain restrictions diverge from yours, the same narrow principle becomes brittle. It risks being read as smuggling in your own commitments, and the audience can dismiss the argument using a strawman tactics. This is why the breadth of a claim is not a stylistic choice, but a structural requirement of cross-framework reasoning. As the distance grows, the shared ground shrinks. The more distant the interlocutor's worldview is from your own, the more you must rely on principles that are abstract, structural, and ambiguity tolerant. These principles avoid presupposing any particular metaphysics or moral theory. They operate at the level of symmetry, consistency, and non-arbitrary boundary rules, norms that nearly all frameworks must accept to remain coherent. By shifting to this level of generality, you prevent the audience from retreating to "that's not what I meant," or you're applying the principle outside its intended domain. Instead, you anchor the argument in the minimal commitments they have already granted. This adjustment in breadth also protects the integrity of the interlock itself. A long-distance interlock only works if it remains parasitic on the other person's commitments, rather than projecting your own onto their view. If your principle is too specific, it will inevitably carry hidden assumptions about harm, agency, identity, or value that the audience does not share. They can then accuse you of misapplication, special pleading, or ignoring the qualifiers they would have added. A broader principle avoids this by leaving open the parts of the argument that depend on their worldview. It forces them either to accept the structural consequence or to articulate the brackets they were relying on, brackets that may themselves require justification. Ambiguity in this context is not a lack of clarity, but a deliberate form of precision. It allows you to specify only what must be shared while leaving the rest uncommitted. This creates a clean argumentative channel. The audience cannot claim you've imported your own theory, and they cannot escape the implications of their own commitments without exposing the hidden premises that were doing the real work. In this way, adjusting the breadth of your claim becomes a method for preventing strawman refutes or objects of absurdity, clarifying the true points of disagreement, and ensuring that the interlock operates on stable, mutually recognized ground. A narrow claim in abortion debates often collapses because it carries hidden assumptions from the speaker's own worldview. When the interlocutor doesn't share those assumptions, the argument is easily reframed irrational using strawman tactics or optical wins. Broadening the claim, especially when speaking across moral, metaphysical, or political distance, allows the conclusion to rest on structural commitments both sides actually share. The contrast becomes clearest when we look at paired examples, one narrow pro-choice argument and one narrow pro-life argument that predictably get strawmanned, followed by broader versions that avoid those pitfalls. 1. A narrow pro-choice claim that gets strawmanned. Narrow claim. Abortion is permissible because the fetus can't feel pain. This is fragile because it embeds a very specific moral assumption, that sentience is the relevant threshold for moral protection. A pro-life interlocutor does not share that assumption. They can easily respond, So are you saying it's okay to kill anyone who can't feel pain? What about anesthesia patients or people in comas? You're reducing moral status to a single biological feature. The narrowness invites the opponent to reinterpret the claim as a general endorsement of killing the non-sentient, which was never the speaker's intention. The argument collapses because the principle was too specific to the speaker's worldview, and too distant from the opponent's broader version that avoids the strawman. Abortion is permissible because moral obligations scale with the kinds of interests a being can have, and early fetuses lack the kinds of interests that generate strong obligations. This broader claim avoids tying moral status to a single biological feature, doesn't imply that all non-sentient humans are killable, allows the interlocutor to specify what they think counts as an interest, shifts the debate to structural questions about interests, obligations, and thresholds. The conclusion, abortion can be permissible, is still reachable, but the principle is now abstract enough to survive cross-framework scrutiny. 2. A narrow pro-life claim that gets strawmanned. Narrow claim. Abortion is wrong because the fetus is a person from conception. This is fragile because it presupposes a metaphysical thesis the pro-choice interlocutor does not share. They can easily respond. You're assuming the very thing in dispute. You're defining personhood into existence. You're treating a zygote like a fully developed human. The narrowness invites the opponent to treat the argument as circular or theological. The conclusion, abortion is wrong, becomes unreachable because the principle is too tied to the speaker's own ontology. Broader version that avoids the strawman. Abortion is wrong when the reasons offered for ending fetal life would be unacceptable if applied to other vulnerable human beings, unless a morally relevant difference can be clearly identified. This broader claim doesn't assume personhood at conception, shifts the burden to identifying morally relevant differences, uses a structural consistency principle rather than a metaphysical assertion, forces the interlocutor to articulate why fetal life is uniquely exempt. The conclusion, abortion is wrong in at least some cases, becomes reachable without relying on contested metaphysics. 3. Why the broader versions work. The broader claims succeed because they operate at the level of shared structural commitments, not worldview-specific assumptions. They rely on principles like consistency, non-arbitrary distinctions, interest-based obligations, symmetry across cases, the need for morally relevant differences. These are principles that almost any moral framework must accept to remain coherent, because they are not tied to a specific ontology of personhood or a specific theory of moral status. They cannot be easily reframed as strawmen. The broader principles also force the interlocutor to reveal the brackets they were relying on, hidden assumptions about what counts as a person, what counts as harm, or what counts as a morally relevant difference. Once those assumptions are exposed, the debate becomes clearer and more productive. 4. The deeper pattern. A narrow claim fails when it embeds your metaphysics. It presumes your domain boundaries. It relies on your weighting of values. It applies a principle in a way the opponent never granted. A broader claim succeeds when it uses structural norms both sides accept. It leaves worldview-specific details open. It forces the opponent to articulate their hidden premises. It keeps the interlock parasitic rather than assertive. This is the core of adjusting claim breadth to avoid strawman challenges. A principle and an argument play different roles in reasoning, even though they often appear together. A principle is a standard, while an argument is a process. Understanding the distinction clarifies why debates go off track when people treat a principle as if it were already an argument, or treat an argument as if it were merely a principle. What a principle is. A principle is a general rule, norm, or standard that guides judgments. It does not, by itself, establish a conclusion. It only states how one ought to reason, or what counts as relevant. Examples. Treat like cases alike, unless a morally relevant difference exists. Harm requires justification. Persons have rights. A principle sets criteria, defines boundaries, identifies what matters morally or logically, applies across many cases, does not yet tell you what follows in a specific case. A principle is like the rulebook. What an argument is. An argument is a structured attempt to justify a conclusion using premises. It applies principles, facts, and reasoning to reach a specific claim. Examples. Because early fetuses lack interests, and obligations scale with interests, abortion is permissible. Because the fetus is a vulnerable human being and no morally relevant difference justifies killing it, abortion is wrong. An argument uses premises, applies principles, draws an inference, aims at a specific conclusion, can succeed or fail depending on structure and truth. An argument is like playing the game according to the rulebook. How they interact. Principles provide the standards that arguments must follow. Arguments provide the justification that principles alone cannot supply. When someone rejects a narrow claim prematurely, it's often because they mistake a principle for an argument, or assume the principle already carries the full argumentative load. Why the distinction matters in debate. If you present a principle as if it were already an argument, the audience rejects it because they think you're smuggling in a conclusion. If you present an argument without clarifying the principle behind it, the audience rejects it because they don't see the standard you're using. If you start with a broad principle, people ask questions. If you start with a narrow argument, people raise objections. This is why broad to narrow sequencing often works better. The principle is accepted first, and the argument grows naturally out of it.